There are places in America where history feels frozen in time, where every empty hallway, every rusted steel bar, and every silent prison cell seems to remember something the rest of the world has struggled to explain. On a cold morning in June of 1962, the silence inside Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary was shattered by alarms, pounding footsteps, and the sound of guards shouting through concrete corridors that had long been considered impossible to escape. Just moments earlier, officers had walked past 3 prison cells believing the men inside were still asleep, unaware that one of the greatest mysteries in American criminal history had already begun. When they returned, they found something so unexpected that it would leave seasoned investigators stunned. 3 prisoners had vanished from the most secure prison in the United States. In their place rested carefully crafted dummy heads, positioned beneath prison blankets with such convincing detail that guards had been fooled until the final moment. Those lifeless faces stared back from the pillows as if mocking the prison that claimed no one could ever escape its walls. It was more than an escape. It was a direct challenge to a system built on absolute certainty, and it raised a question that has echoed across generations ever since. Authorities moved quickly. Searchlights swept across the dark waters surrounding Alcatraz Island. Coast Guard boats raced through the icy currents of San Francisco Bay. Helicopters searched from above while officers scanned every wave, convinced the escape could only end one way. The official belief seemed simple enough. The water was brutally cold. The currents were powerful enough to pull even experienced swimmers out toward the Pacific Ocean. Survival appeared almost impossible. Within hours, the search expanded into one of the largest manhunts in modern American history. Yet as the days passed, something continued to trouble investigators. No bodies surfaced. No confirmed evidence proved the escapees had drowned. No witness could say with certainty where the men had gone after disappearing into the darkness. Instead of bringing answers, every passing year seemed to introduce another unsettling question. Strange letters would later appear. Mysterious photographs would emerge decades after the escape. Former investigators would quietly admit that some pieces of evidence never fit neatly into the official conclusion. Families refused to believe their loved ones had died. Independent researchers uncovered details that reignited public fascination. Even today, more than 6 decades later, the mystery refuses to fade because the evidence has never pointed completely in one direction. The story you are about to hear is based on one of the most remarkable prison escapes ever attempted. Reconstructed from historical records, investigative reports, witness accounts, and decades of public fascination. While some personal names have been changed for storytelling purposes, the extraordinary events, timeline, and evidence remain rooted in the documented case that continues to captivate historians and investigators alike. This is not simply a story about 3 inmates trying to outrun prison walls. It is a story about human determination, meticulous planning, unanswered questions, and a mystery that has challenged official conclusions for generations. Every clue uncovered seemed to create another mystery. Every answer raised another possibility. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what investigators discovered inside those prison walls on that unforgettable morning was only the beginning. And as you'll soon discover, the truth surrounding the 1962 Alcatraz escape may be even more extraordinary than the legend itself. Long before it became one of America's most visited historical landmarks, Alcatraz stood as a symbol of absolute punishment. Rising from a rocky island in the middle of San Francisco Bay, it was never intended to be an ordinary prison. It was built to house the inmates other prisons could no longer control, men whose repeated escapes, violent crimes, and refusal to obey authority had earned them a place where the government believed escape was simply beyond human possibility. Every detail of the island served a single purpose. The towering concrete walls, the armed guards stationed in watchtowers, the reinforced steel bars, the frequent inmate counts, and the carefully monitored routines all worked together to send one unmistakable message. Once you arrived at Alcatraz, your journey ended there. It was less a correctional institution than a fortress designed to strip away the very idea of freedom. Former inmates would later describe the prison as a place where hope disappeared long before a sentence was complete. For many, the isolation proved just as punishing as the prison itself. The island's greatest defense, however, wasn't the prison at all. It was the water that surrounded it. From the shoreline, San Francisco looked close enough to touch, tempting prisoners with the illusion that freedom lay only a short distance away. In reality, those waters were among the most dangerous in the country. Temperatures remained cold enough to quickly drain a swimmer's strength, while unpredictable tides and powerful currents could carry even experienced swimmers far from their intended destination. For decades, many people believed the bay was filled with man-eating sharks waiting for anyone foolish enough to attempt an escape. In truth, sharks were never considered the primary danger. The real threat came from the freezing water, exhaustion, and currents capable of overwhelming even the strongest athlete. Those natural defenses, combined with constant surveillance, helped create Alcatraz's legendary reputation. Officials proudly claimed that no inmate had ever successfully escaped and survived. It became one of the prison's defining myths, repeated so often that few dared question whether it was actually true. Yet among the men confined behind those walls were individuals who refused to accept impossible as the final answer. One of them was Frank Morris, a prisoner whose intelligence and history of attempted escapes had already earned the attention of federal authorities long before he arrived on the island. Unlike many inmates, Frank was known for his patience. He observed everything, spoke little, and rarely acted without careful planning. Sharing the prison with him were brothers Clarence Anglin and John Anglin, men who had spent much of their lives working together, and who possessed a bond strengthened by years of hardship. Raised near rivers and accustomed to life around water, the brothers carried skills that investigators would later examine with great interest after their disappearance. Together, these three men formed an unlikely partnership inside one of the most heavily guarded prisons in America. At first glance, they appeared no different from the hundreds of other inmates serving time on the island. Yet hidden beneath their ordinary routines was an ambition that would eventually challenge everything the federal government believed about its most secure prison. More than 60 years after that unforgettable morning, the same questions continue to divide investigators, historians, and former law enforcement officials. Did Frank Morris, Clarence Anglin, and John Anglin perish in the icy waters surrounding Alcatraz as authorities originally concluded? Or did they accomplish what generations believed could never be done, disappearing into the darkness and beginning new lives beyond the reach of the law? If they drowned, why were their bodies never recovered despite one of the largest search operations in FBI history? Why did federal investigators continue pursuing leads and reviewing evidence long after publicly stating they believed the men had died? And how do mysterious letters, reported sightings, and unexplained photographs fit into a case that many assumed had already been solved? Even today, experts remain deeply divided because every explanation seems to answer one question while creating another. To understand how Frank Morris, Clarence Anglin, and John Anglin appeared to vanish from a prison built to make escape impossible, we first need to understand the institution that was never supposed to let anyone leave. To understand how three men could disappear from a prison that represented the very definition of maximum security, we first need to understand the people at the center of the mystery. Long before newspapers carried their photographs, and before the FBI devoted years to tracking their movements, Frank Morris, Clarence Anglin, and John Anglin were simply inmates serving federal sentences inside Alcatraz. Yet prison records, interviews, and historical accounts reveal that these men possessed qualities that set them apart from many of the other prisoners around them. They were patient where others became reckless, observant where others gave in to routine, and perhaps most importantly, they never completely surrendered to the belief that Alcatraz was impossible to escape. While most inmates eventually accepted that every day would look exactly like the one before it, these three men quietly studied the prison itself, treating every wall, every corridor, and every daily routine as if it contained information waiting to be uncovered. Among them, Frank Morris stood out almost immediately. Prison officials regarded him as exceptionally intelligent, with reports often describing him as possessing an IQ well above average. He spoke little, preferred observation over conversation, and rarely attracted unnecessary attention. That quiet personality often caused others to underestimate him. But Frank had already developed a reputation throughout the federal prison system as someone who viewed confinement as a challenge rather than a permanent reality. Before arriving at Alcatraz, he had spent time in several correctional institutions and had attempted multiple escapes, demonstrating remarkable ingenuity even when those efforts ultimately failed. Each transfer from one prison to another seemed to strengthen his resolve instead of weakening it. To Frank, prison walls were not simply barriers, they were problems waiting to be solved. Rather than reacting emotionally to his circumstances, he relied on patience, discipline, and careful planning. Those who encountered him often described a man who revealed very little about what he was thinking, making him one of the most difficult inmates for prison officials to truly understand. Looking back, investigators would later wonder whether Frank had begun studying Alcatraz almost from the moment he first stepped onto the island. Clarence Anglin and John Anglin brought something entirely different to the partnership. The brothers grew up in a large farming family, where hard physical work began at an early age and cooperation wasn't optional but simply part of everyday life. Their childhood was spent working fields, repairing equipment, and helping support their family, experiences that created a bond difficult to break even after adulthood led them down very different paths. During seasonal work, they also spent countless hours around rivers and lakes, becoming confident swimmers long before anyone imagined those skills might someday become part of one of America's greatest prison mysteries. Years later, investigators would repeatedly examine that detail because surviving the waters surrounding Alcatraz required far more than courage alone. It demanded endurance, experience, and the ability to remain calm under extreme conditions. Clarence and John had spent nearly their entire lives working side by side, developing an almost instinctive understanding of each other's actions without needing many words. Inside prison, that lifelong trust remained intact. They shared responsibilities, watched each other's backs, and approached every challenge as a team. While Frank Morris often supplied the careful strategy, the Anglin brothers brought determination, practical skills, and unwavering loyalty to the plan that was quietly beginning to take shape. There was, however, a fourth man whose role in this remarkable story is often overlooked. His name was Allen West. Like Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers, Allen had grown tired of the endless routine of life inside Alcatraz. Historical records indicate that he became an essential member of the escape plot, contributing ideas, assisting with preparations, and working alongside the others as they searched for weaknesses within the prison's design. For months, the four men trusted one another with information that could have brought severe punishment had it ever reached prison officials. Yet history would ultimately remember Allen very differently from the others. On the night everything changed, while Frank Morris, Clarence Anglin, and John Anglin continued moving forward with the escape, Allen encountered a devastating problem. The opening he had spent months enlarging was still too small. Despite repeated attempts to force his way through the narrow passage, he couldn't free himself in time. Every minute that passed increased the risk of discovery. According to his later account, the others could not afford to wait any longer. They continued without him, leaving Allen trapped inside the prison that all four men had hoped to leave behind together. By sunrise, he remained inside Alcatraz while the others had vanished into history. Life inside Alcatraz rarely changed from one day to the next. Every morning began according to the same schedule. Prisoners awoke at designated times, counted by guards who knew exactly how many men should occupy each cell block. Meals followed strict routines. Work assignments filled the daylight hours. Recreation was limited, conversations were monitored, and silence often settled over the prison long after lights out. The purpose of this routine extended far beyond maintaining order. It was designed to wear down resistance. Days blended into weeks, weeks into years, until many inmates stopped imagining a future beyond the island. Yet routines have an unintended weakness. When every day follows the same predictable pattern, people become accustomed to seeing the same things over and over. Familiarity can dull even the sharpest attention. Somewhere within that rigid system, Frank Morris, Clarence Anglin, John Anglin, and Allen West recognized an opportunity hidden in plain sight. It did not begin with dramatic discoveries or secret blueprints. Instead, it began with careful observation. Behind the sinks inside several cells were small ventilation openings connected to an old utility corridor. Years of moisture and aging construction had weakened portions of the concrete surrounding those vents. Maintenance work over the decades had left subtle imperfections that attracted little attention, because no one believed an inmate could possibly exploit them. To prison staff, they were insignificant flaws. To four men studying every inch of their surroundings, they represented possibility. The openings were far too small for anyone to crawl through, but that wasn't the point. What mattered was that the concrete surrounding them wasn't as solid as officials believed. Little by little, almost grain by grain, those weak points became the focus of extraordinary patience. Nothing happened quickly. There were no dramatic breakthroughs. Every small success required time, precision, and absolute secrecy. As weeks quietly turned into months, the prison continued operating exactly as it always had. Guards conducted inspections. Officers walked the same corridors. Prisoners followed the same schedules. Yet hidden just beyond ordinary view, something remarkable was unfolding. Tiny amounts of concrete disappeared. Ordinary objects slowly found new purposes. Every movement was carefully measured to avoid attracting suspicion. Looking back, it almost seems unbelievable that so much preparation could take place inside one of the most heavily guarded prisons in America without anyone realizing what was happening. But that is precisely what makes this story so extraordinary. The escape that would eventually astonish the nation was never the result of one bold decision made in a single night. It was the product of countless quiet moments, each one building upon the last until an opportunity that once seemed impossible gradually became achievable. For months, prison guards walked past evidence of an escape happening right beneath their noses. These men weren't acting impulsively or chasing a desperate fantasy. They were patiently constructing a plan that demanded remarkable discipline, complete trust, and an extraordinary willingness to wait for exactly the right moment. And by the time anyone realized what they had been doing, the final pieces of that carefully crafted plan were already falling into place. By the spring of 1962, the plan had moved far beyond imagination. What had started as careful observation had evolved into one of the most ambitious escape attempts ever conceived inside an American prison. Every day, while guards believed they were supervising an ordinary cell block, Frank Morris, Clarence Anglin, John Anglin, and Allen West continued preparing for a single night that would determine whether months of patience had been worthwhile. or whether it would all end in failure. They understood there would be no second chance. One mistake, one unexpected inspection, or one misplaced sound echoing through the concrete walls could expose everything they had spent months building. Yet they pressed forward with remarkable discipline, never rushing the process, never allowing excitement to replace caution. That patience would become one of the defining reasons their plan came closer to success than anyone thought possible. The tools they possessed would have seemed almost worthless to anyone else. There were no power drills, no industrial cutting equipment, and no sophisticated escape devices smuggled into the prison. Instead, they relied on ordinary objects that existed inside Alcatraz itself. Metal spoons, stolen or borrowed over time, became scraping tools capable of slowly chipping away weakened concrete around the ventilation openings hidden behind their sinks. The work was painfully slow. Every small piece of concrete removed represented hours of effort. According to historical accounts, they often disguised the noise by working during periods when music played throughout the prison, making it more difficult for guards to distinguish unusual sounds from ordinary activity. They also demonstrated remarkable ingenuity by modifying the motor from a discarded vacuum cleaner into a crude homemade drill. Though simple by modern standards, the device provided enough power to speed up the painstaking work without attracting immediate suspicion. Nothing about the escape depended on strength alone. It depended on creativity, patience, and the ability to see opportunity where everyone else saw limitation. As the openings behind their cells gradually became larger, another challenge emerged. Even if they successfully left their cells, guards performing nighttime inspections still needed to believe the prisoners remained asleep. Once again, the men turned to improvisation. Using paper mache, soap, plaster, and other materials gathered over many months, they carefully sculpted lifelike dummy heads designed to resemble themselves. They painted facial features by hand and attached real human hair collected from the prison barbershop. Under the dim lighting used during nighttime rounds, the effect proved remarkably convincing. Resting naturally on pillows beneath neatly arranged blankets, the figures created the illusion of sleeping prisoners. Looking at photographs taken after the escape, it is still difficult to believe they were handmade inside a maximum security prison. The deception reflected not only artistic skill but also a deep understanding of human psychology. Guards performing routine checks expected to see sleeping inmates, and that expectation became one of the escapees' greatest advantages. Yet escaping the prison building itself solved only part of the problem. Beyond the walls waited the freezing waters of San Francisco Bay, and without a reliable way to cross them, every effort inside the prison would mean nothing. The solution they devised remains one of the most remarkable aspects of the entire operation. Over many months, the men quietly collected dozens of rubber raincoats issued to inmates. Piece by piece, they stitched and sealed the waterproof material together into a makeshift inflatable raft large enough to carry multiple people. They also fashioned improvised life preservers and wooden paddles, all assembled inside a hidden workspace concealed above the cell block in an unoccupied utility area reached through the widened ventilation system. This secret workshop became the heart of the operation, a place where every critical piece of equipment was prepared beyond the view of prison staff. Night after night, while Alcatraz settled into silence, the workshop slowly filled with evidence that one of the most extraordinary escape attempts in American history was approaching its final stage. Then came the evening of June 11, 1962. As darkness settled over Alcatraz, the prison followed its familiar routine. Final inmate counts were completed. Cell doors slammed shut with a heavy metallic sound that echoed through every corridor. Lights gradually dimmed. Guards continued their patrols exactly as they had countless nights before, believing nothing about this evening was different from any other. Inside their cells, however, Frank Morris, Clarence Anglin, John Anglin, and Alan West knew the moment they had spent months preparing for had finally arrived. There would be no turning back. One by one, they placed the carefully crafted dummy heads beneath their blankets, arranged them to resemble sleeping bodies, and quietly moved toward the enlarged ventilation openings hidden behind their sinks. Every movement had been rehearsed in their minds countless times. Every second mattered. Frank Morris entered the narrow opening first, disappearing into the darkness beyond the cell wall. Clarence Anglin and John Anglin followed close behind, crawling through the cramped passageways connecting the cells to the hidden utility corridor beyond. From there, they climbed upward through the network of maintenance spaces that few prison staff ever entered. They crossed areas above the cell block roof, moving carefully to avoid making noise that might echo below. Historical investigations later concluded that the men eventually reached the exterior of the prison, descended pipes attached to the building, and carefully made their way toward the shoreline where their homemade raft awaited. Every obstacle they had anticipated over months of planning now unfolded exactly as intended. But not everything went according to plan. Alan West soon realized that despite months of effort, the opening behind his sink remained just slightly too narrow. He scraped desperately at the remaining concrete, trying to enlarge the passage enough to squeeze through. Time slipped away with every attempt. Above him, Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers were already moving toward the island's edge. Allen later stated that he repeatedly called out, hoping they might return or wait a little longer. But they understood something he also knew. Every additional minute increased the likelihood that guards would discover the escape before they reached the water. The decision they faced was impossible: wait and risk everyone being captured, leave and abandon the fourth member of the plan. According to Allen's account, the three men continued without him. Alone inside his cell, he listened as the opportunity they had all worked toward for months disappeared into the darkness beyond the prison walls. Sometime during the night, Frank Morris, Clarence Anglin, and John Anglin vanished from Alcatraz Island. Whether they launched their homemade raft immediately or waited for the right moment remains one of the many unanswered questions that still surround the case. What is certain is that by sunrise, they were gone. The following morning began like every other. Guards started their routine inmate count, walking calmly past rows of cells where prisoners appeared to be asleep. Nothing initially seemed unusual. Then one officer paused outside Frank Morris's cell. Something about the figure lying beneath the blanket caught his attention. He stepped closer and reached toward what appeared to be Frank's head. The moment his hand touched it, the carefully crafted dummy rolled from the pillow and crashed onto the concrete floor. For a brief instant, silence filled the corridor. Then the realization struck: the prisoner wasn't there, neither were Clarence Anglin or John Anglin. Within seconds, alarms echoed across the island. Guards rushed through the prison, searching every corridor, every utility space, and every locked door. Searchlights swept across the shoreline. Sirens pierced the morning air. Coast Guard vessels raced into the bay while helicopters searched overhead. The prison that had built its reputation on being escape-proof suddenly faced the unthinkable reality that 3 inmates had disappeared without leaving a clear trace behind. Investigators quickly located the area where the men were believed to have entered the water. The improvised launching point stood empty. The raft, if it had survived the crossing, was nowhere to be seen. Frank Morris, Clarence Anglin, and John Anglin had vanished into one of the most dangerous stretches of water in America, leaving behind only questions that would outlive the prison itself. But what investigators found floating in San Francisco Bay during the days that followed would shape the official story for decades. Within hours of the discovery, Alcatraz was no longer simply a federal prison dealing with an escape. It had become the center of one of the largest and most determined manhunts in modern American history. News spread rapidly across California and then throughout the nation. Newspapers printed dramatic headlines announcing that 3 inmates had apparently accomplished what generations of prisoners had failed to do. For the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the stakes extended far beyond locating Frank Morris, Clarence Anglin, and John Anglin. The reputation of America's most secure prison had been challenged in full public view. If the 3 men had survived, it would force officials to confront an unsettling possibility: that the prison designed to be escape-proof had, in fact, been defeated. Agents from the FBI quickly joined prison officials, the United States Coast Guard, local law enforcement, and military personnel in an extensive search that stretched across San Francisco Bay and beyond. Every available resource seemed focused on answering one question before the escapees could disappear forever. Time was critical because if the men had reached the mainland alive, every passing hour increased the distance they could travel and the number of places they could hide. The search unfolded with extraordinary intensity. Coast Guard vessels repeatedly swept through the bay, examining shorelines, small islands, and isolated coves where survivors might have landed. Helicopters searched from above while patrol boats traced routes shaped by tides and ocean currents. Military personnel assisted in surveying surrounding waters, and investigators interviewed fishermen, ferry operators, harbor workers, and residents living along the shoreline. The FBI reviewed maps, reconstructed possible escape routes, and calculated how the currents might have carried both people and debris. Search teams spent thousands of hours combing beaches and waterways, hoping to recover evidence that would reveal the fate of the 3 missing men. Every discovery, no matter how small, was treated as potentially significant because investigators understood they were dealing with an escape unlike any before it. Yet despite the enormous scale of the operation, certainty remained frustratingly out of reach. As the search continued, pieces of evidence slowly began appearing across the bay. Investigators recovered what appeared to be a homemade wooden paddle floating in the water. Fragments believed to have come from one of the improvised life preservers were also located. A waterproof package containing personal belongings connected to the escape attracted particular attention, along with a wallet reportedly associated with one of the Anglin brothers. These discoveries seemed to support the idea that the raft had encountered trouble in the harsh conditions of San Francisco Bay. To many investigators, the scattered items suggested that powerful currents may have torn apart portions of the escape equipment before the men could safely reach land. It was a logical conclusion based on the evidence available at the time, and as additional searches failed to locate the escapees, officials gradually became more confident in their assessment. Eventually, the government's official position became clear. Frank Morris, Clarence Anglin, and John Anglin were believed to have drowned while attempting to cross the bay. The freezing water, combined with exhaustion and unpredictable currents, offered what many experts considered the most reasonable explanation. It was a conclusion supported by the dangerous conditions surrounding Alcatraz and by the debris recovered during the search. From an investigative standpoint, the theory made sense. Yet there was one problem that refused to disappear. Despite the extensive search involving federal agents, the Coast Guard, and military resources, not one body was ever recovered. No confirmed human remains belonging to Frank Morris, Clarence Anglin, or John Anglin were found. There were no verified deaths, no funerals, and no physical evidence that conclusively proved the three men had perished in the bay. The official explanation answered many questions, but it left one of the most important questions unresolved. If they drowned, where were they? As months became years, public attention slowly faded, but the mystery never completely disappeared. Then something unexpected began happening. Members of the Anglin family reported receiving anonymous Christmas cards signed in the names of Clarence and John. On several occasions, mysterious flowers were delivered to their mother's home, arriving without any clear indication of who had sent them. According to family members, these gestures continued the hope that the brothers might still be alive somewhere, quietly watching from a distance while avoiding public attention. Skeptics argued that anyone could have mailed anonymous cards or arranged flowers as a cruel prank, but supporters of the survival theory viewed them very differently. To them, these acts represented carefully controlled signals from men who wanted their family to know they were alive without exposing their location to law enforcement. Whether genuine or coincidental, the reports ensured that speculation surrounding the escape never truly disappeared. Rumors spread steadily over the following decades. Individuals claimed to have seen Frank Morris in different parts of the country. Others insisted the Anglin brothers had secretly settled in another state under assumed identities. Some reports came from people who sincerely believed they had recognized the escapees years after 1962. Others proved impossible to verify. As with many famous unsolved mysteries, separating fact from rumor became increasingly difficult. Every new sighting generated fresh headlines before eventually fading into uncertainty. Yet despite publicly maintaining that the men had likely drowned, the FBI continued reviewing credible leads for years. Whenever potentially reliable information surfaced, investigators quietly examined it rather than immediately dismissing it. The case remained open far longer than many members of the public realized, reflecting the simple reality that no conclusive proof of death had ever been obtained. Then, decades after the escape, one piece of evidence reignited international interest in the mystery. A photograph reportedly taken in Brazil surfaced, allegedly showing two men standing together on a rural property. Supporters of the survival theory claimed the men closely resembled Clarence Anglin and John Anglin many years after their disappearance from Alcatraz. If authentic, the image would dramatically challenge the long-held belief that the brothers had died in San Francisco Bay. The photograph immediately became one of the most debated pieces of evidence connected to the case. Facial recognition specialists and forensic analysts were asked to examine facial structure, proportions, and distinguishing features in an effort to determine whether the men in the image could truly be the Anglin brothers. Some experts argued that the similarities deserved serious consideration. Others maintained that the quality of the photograph and the passage of time made any definitive identification impossible. Rather than resolving the mystery, the analysis deepened it. Once again, every apparent answer created another unanswered question. For those convinced the escape had succeeded, the Brazil photograph became a powerful symbol that Frank Morris, Clarence Anglin, and John Anglin had accomplished the impossible. For skeptics, it represented another intriguing but ultimately inconclusive piece of evidence in a case already filled with speculation. More than 60 years after the escape, investigators, historians, and forensic experts still find themselves examining the same clues from different perspectives, arriving at different conclusions while acknowledging the same uncomfortable truth. No single piece of evidence has ever definitively settled what happened after the three men disappeared into the darkness on June 11, 1962. Then years later, a letter arrived that stunned investigators. The letter arrived more than 50 years after Frank Morris, Clarence Anglin, and John Anglin disappeared from Alcatraz. Addressed to law enforcement and written by someone claiming to be one of the escapees, it immediately attracted worldwide attention. In the handwritten message, the author claimed that all three men had survived the escape from Alcatraz in 1962. According to the letter, Frank Morris had died years earlier, as had Clarence Anglin, leaving John Anglin as the only surviving member of the group. The writer stated that he was elderly, battling serious health problems, and willing to surrender under certain conditions. It was an extraordinary claim, one that seemed almost too remarkable to believe. Investigators carefully examined the document, comparing handwriting, searching for fingerprints, and evaluating every detail that might establish its authenticity. Yet despite extensive analysis, they were never able to confirm with certainty that the letter had actually been written by John Anglin. Neither could they completely rule it out. Once again, the Alcatraz mystery refused to provide a clear answer. The document joined a growing collection of evidence that existed somewhere between possibility and proof, leaving investigators exactly where they had been for decades, surrounded by questions but separated from certainty. By this point, two very different explanations had emerged, each supported by evidence that appeared convincing on its own. The first remained the official conclusion reached shortly after the escape. According to this theory, Frank Morris, Clarence Anglin, and John Anglin successfully left the prison but never survived the crossing. San Francisco Bay was and still is an unforgiving environment. Water temperatures can quickly lead to hypothermia, reducing strength and coordination within a relatively short period. Powerful tidal currents are capable of carrying swimmers far from their intended course, sometimes into the open Pacific Ocean. During the original search, investigators recovered floating items believed to be connected to the escape, including a paddle, pieces of a homemade life preserver, and personal belongings associated with the men. To many investigators, these discoveries suggested that the raft may have failed before reaching safety. Combined with the harsh conditions of the bay, this explanation seemed both logical and consistent with the evidence available at the time. For decades, it remained the position accepted by federal authorities because it best explained why the escapees never publicly resurfaced. Yet there has always been another possibility, one that continues to capture the imagination of historians, investigators, and millions of people fascinated by unsolved mysteries. Supporters of the survival theory point to several important facts that distinguish the Alcatraz escape from many others. Clarence Anglin and John Anglin had spent much of their lives around water, developing strong swimming abilities from an early age. Frank Morris was widely regarded as exceptionally intelligent, with a long history of carefully planned escape attempts that demonstrated remarkable resourcefulness. Together, the three men spent months constructing an inflatable raft from dozens of waterproof prison-issued raincoats, a project requiring planning, patience, and considerable ingenuity. If the raft functioned as intended, they may never have needed to swim the entire distance. Investigators also acknowledged that tidal conditions on certain nights could potentially assist rather than hinder a carefully timed crossing. While surviving such a journey remained incredibly dangerous, some experts have argued that it was not physically impossible under the right circumstances. That distinction has remained central to the debate ever since. Supporters of the survival theory also point toward the evidence that surfaced long after the original investigation had ended. The reported Christmas cards received by members of the Anglin family, the mysterious flowers delivered to their mother over the years, the alleged sightings of Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers in different parts of the country. The controversial photograph reportedly taken in Brazil, showing two men many believe closely resemble Clarence and John Anglin decades after the escape. None of these pieces of evidence alone proves survival. Each has been challenged, questioned, or explained in different ways. Yet together they form a collection of unresolved clues that continue to prevent the case from reaching a universally accepted conclusion. Even the FBI's own records reflect years of continued investigation after the escape, demonstrating that federal authorities continued examining credible leads long after publicly stating they believed the men had drowned. To some observers, that continued interest suggests investigators themselves recognized that important questions remained unanswered. Modern forensic science has added another layer to the debate without fully resolving it. Advances in facial comparison technology have allowed specialists to examine the Brazil photograph in greater detail than was possible when it first emerged. Analysts have compared facial proportions, bone structure, and other identifying features with historical photographs of Clarence and John Anglin. Some experts believe the similarities are significant enough to justify continued interest. Others argue that the image quality, aging process, and limited reference material make any definitive conclusion impossible. Oceanographers have also revisited the conditions present on the night of June 11, 1962, using modern computer models to simulate tides and currents. Interestingly, some simulations suggest that under a carefully timed departure, a raft launched from Alcatraz could have reached parts of the mainland rather than being carried directly out to sea. Other studies, however, conclude that even with favorable timing, the risks remained extraordinarily high. These scientific analyses have refined our understanding of what might have happened, but they have not delivered the certainty investigators have sought for more than 6 decades. The alleged 2013 letter remains equally unresolved. Handwriting experts, forensic specialists, and investigators all examined the document, yet no consensus emerged regarding its authenticity. Without verified DNA, confirmed fingerprints, or independent evidence connecting the writer to John Anglin, the letter remains exactly what it has always been: an unverified claim. It cannot be accepted as proof that the escape succeeded, but neither can it be completely dismissed as meaningless. Like so much else connected to this case, it occupies that frustrating space between fact and possibility, adding one more chapter to a story already filled with unanswered questions. Perhaps that is why the Alcatraz escape continues to fascinate generation after generation. It is not simply because three men disappeared from a prison once believed impossible to escape. It is because, after decades of investigations, technological advances, forensic examinations, witness interviews, and countless hours spent reviewing evidence, no one has ever been able to prove beyond reasonable doubt what happened after Frank Morris, Clarence Anglin, and John Anglin vanished into the darkness. If they drowned, why has no confirmed evidence of their deaths ever been found? If they survived, how did they remain hidden for the rest of their lives without leaving behind undeniable proof? The greatest mystery is no longer whether the escape itself succeeded. The greatest mystery is why, despite every investigation and every new discovery, the truth remains just beyond our reach, leaving one of the FBI's most enduring cases suspended between history and legend. Today, Alcatraz is no longer a place where prison guards patrol cell blocks or where inmates wait anxiously for the sound of morning count. Ferries now carry thousands of visitors to the island each year instead of federal prisoners. Tourists walk through the same corridors where Frank Morris, Clarence Anglin, John Anglin, and Alan West once followed the rigid routines of prison life. They stop outside the weathered cells, peer through the rusted bars, and listen as guides recount the remarkable events of June 11 and June 12, 1962. Many pause in front of the reconstructed ventilation openings and carefully crafted dummy heads, trying to imagine how such an extraordinary escape could have unfolded without immediate detection. The prison itself has fallen silent, but the questions left behind continue to echo through every hallway. Time has transformed Alcatraz from a symbol of federal authority into something else entirely, a place where one unanswered mystery has become just as famous as the prison itself. Most criminal investigations end with certainty. This one never did. There was no courtroom verdict bringing the story to its final chapter. There were no confirmed remains proving exactly where Frank Morris, Clarence Anglin, and John Anglin met their fate. There was no verified confession explaining every detail of the escape or revealing what happened after they disappeared into the darkness of San Francisco Bay. Instead, investigators were left with carefully crafted dummy heads, a remarkable homemade raft, scattered pieces of evidence, conflicting theories, and decades of speculation. Every new clue seemed to answer one question while creating another. Every investigation uncovered details that were both compelling and incomplete. Even after advances in forensic science, facial comparison technology, and modern ocean current analysis, the case still refuses to fit neatly into a single explanation. Few investigations remain suspended between official history and enduring mystery for more than 6 decades. This one has done exactly that. Perhaps that is because this story reaches beyond the walls of a prison. At its heart, it is about something deeply human. It is about determination in circumstances designed to destroy hope. Frank Morris, Clarence Anglin, John Anglin, and Alan West lived inside a prison specifically engineered to convince every inmate that escape was impossible. Every wall, every locked gate, every guard tower, and every freezing wave surrounding the island existed for one purpose: to remove the belief that freedom could ever be reached. Yet somewhere within those walls, 4 men refused to accept that conclusion. Whether history ultimately remembers them as successful escapees or as men who lost their lives pursuing freedom, their willingness to challenge what everyone else believed impossible continues to fascinate people around the world. Their story reminds us that human beings have an extraordinary ability to imagine possibilities even when every visible obstacle suggests otherwise. The mystery also reminds us of something equally important about institutions. Alcatraz represented the very best security measures the federal government could assemble during its time. It was considered the prison from which no one could escape. Yet regardless of what happened after Frank Morris, Clarence Anglin, and John Anglin entered the waters surrounding the island, one undeniable fact remains. They successfully left their cells, crossed the prison, reached the shoreline, and forced one of the largest federal investigations of its era. In doing so, they permanently challenged the reputation of an institution that had built its identity on absolute certainty. Even the most carefully designed systems can contain weaknesses. Even the strongest walls can conceal overlooked flaws. And sometimes the greatest challenge to an institution is not proving that it failed, but proving beyond doubt exactly how far that failure extended. That may also explain why unsolved mysteries continue to capture our imagination long after other stories fade from memory. Human nature seeks conclusions. We want certainty. We want every question answered and every loose end tied together. But some stories resist that ending. They remain unfinished because the evidence never fully settles the debate. Instead of offering closure, they invite each new generation to examine the facts again, question old assumptions, and search for answers that may never come. The Alcatraz escape has become one of those rare stories. It survives not because of rumor alone, but because enough credible evidence exists to keep reasonable people disagreeing. Historians continue studying it. Former investigators continue discussing it. Visitors continue standing inside those empty cells asking themselves the very same question people asked in 1962. Whether Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers reached freedom or were claimed by the waters of San Francisco Bay, their escape forever changed the reputation of America's most famous prison. They transformed what had once been considered an impossible fortress into the setting of one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in American history. More than 60 years later, the evidence still refuses to deliver a final verdict. Until definitive proof emerges, the fate of Frank Morris, Clarence Anglin, and John Anglin will remain one of the FBI's most enduring unsolved investigations, a mystery preserved not only in official case files, but also within the silent concrete walls of Alcatraz, where every empty cell seems to ask the same question that has never truly been answered: what really happened after three men disappeared into the darkness? More than 6 decades have passed since Frank Morris, Clarence Anglin, and John Anglin disappeared from Alcatraz, yet the questions they left behind remain as compelling today as they were on that June morning in 1962. Every piece of evidence we've explored tells part of the story, but none of it tells the entire story. The carefully crafted dummy heads, the homemade raft assembled from prison raincoats, the floating belongings recovered from San Francisco Bay, the years of FBI investigation, the reported family contacts, the controversial Brazil photograph, and the unverified letter claiming one of the escapees survived all point toward possibilities rather than certainty. Perhaps that is why this case continues to occupy such a unique place in American history. It asks us to weigh the evidence for ourselves, to question long-held assumptions, and to consider whether one of the greatest prison escapes ever attempted ended in tragedy or triumph. So now we'd like to hear from you. After examining every clue, every theory, and every piece of evidence, what do you believe happened on that June night in 1962? Do you think Frank Morris, Clarence Anglin, and John Anglin were overcome by the freezing waters and powerful currents of San Francisco Bay? Or do you believe they accomplished what generations believed was impossible and successfully escaped Alcatraz, disappearing into new lives beyond the reach of the authorities? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We read your comments, and some of the most thoughtful discussions on this channel come from viewers who bring their own perspectives, knowledge, and theories to mysteries just like this one. And if you found this investigation fascinating, there's much more to uncover. History is filled with remarkable cases where official conclusions have been questioned, forgot evidence has resurfaced, and decades-old mysteries continue to challenge investigators even today. In our next documentary, we'll examine another true story where the truth remained hidden for years, leaving behind questions that still have no definitive answers. If you don't want to miss that investigation, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you'll be among the first to join us when we uncover another extraordinary mystery. Until then, thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next investigation.